When you do that, if you look at the scriptures as the source of knowledge, and you read them as you would any book in a historical, literal, or plain meaning, with understanding the grammar, which is the way we explain or understand anything that we read. As you read what's on the slides, you look at the words, you look at the context, you look at the grammar. You look at what the words mean, you look at how the sentence is constructed. This is all just the standard historical, literal, grammatical understanding of the Bible. When you do that, you can develop a special creation model. That Genesis is what it purports to be, a historical account, beginning in Genesis 1 through the end. And it describes the creation of God in creating the universe, the earth, and life. And it also gives important information about the fall of man and the consequences of disobedience and the judgment that came upon mankind because of that disobedience, not only just in the fall, but then in the flood. And the plain reading of that first chapter is that there were 6 days of creative work of 24 hours in duration. The genealogies of Genesis 5 that David talked about suggest that the earth is about 6,000 years old, and that God was the one who specially created plants, animals, and people. And that's the special creation model. It just comes from a literal, plain, historical, grammatical reading. Nothing special, no gymnastics. But what about the geologic ages? So these are reasonable questions. When you look at the general revelation and you say, but there's this column of layers, of sedimentary layers, geologic ages, which must be millions of years, hundreds of millions of years. What about evolution? What about this idea that all life is descended from a common ancestor? And that process occurs very slowly, just like the buildup of rock layers over time occurs very slowly. Evolution would occur very slowly, as we see captured in the rocks. And what about radioisotope dating? When you take igneous rocks and you measure the relationship of isotopes one to another, that says that these are millions and hundreds of millions of years old, these rock formations. What about this conflict with millions and millions of years that appears to come from the general revelation? Well, I have a Boy Scout as a son, and I want to use the analogy of a Boy Scout picking up a stick. And this is, of course, if you take a Boy Scout camp-out trip, this is the first thing that little boys do when they get outside, is they pick up a stick. And that becomes their stick. And if they put it down and lose it, they cry. That is their stick, and they want to take it home with them. So if you pick up a stick, and let's let that stick represent millions and millions of years in the geologic ages, the time of evolution, and the time of radioactive isotope dating. You've now got this stick of time, and you have to fit it in somewhere. You've got to pick up this stick and carry it. And the stick comes from this understanding of general revelation, we look at these layers, we look at life and the history of life that is laid down in the rocks, and we look at things that are highly technical in regard to isotopic dating. And we pick up the stick, and now we have to put it somewhere. We have to carry it with us, and we have to put it somewhere. So the question is, where does this big stick fit when it comes to the Bible? Because it seems that now, when you adopt the millions of years, you're adopting the general revelation above the special revelation. That you're reading the sequel before you read the first novel. And the question is, where does it fit? And I know this is a difficult slide to see, but this is the day-age theory, sometimes now called progressive creationism. And this is what Hugh Ross represents, his group. And he's got a stick of millions, hundreds of millions of years that he has to fit in to his understanding of the first chapters of Genesis. And so he does that by broadening out the days of Genesis to become millions and billions of years. In fact, he goes back with his days all the way back to the beginning of the earth, 4.5 billion years, and then comes up for day 1 to about 3 billion years. And day 2 goes from 3 billion years to 2 point something billion years. And these are the formations and development of bacteria and photosynthesis and the Cambrian explosion eventually at this point, and then day 3, and then you can see days, I didn't mark off days 4, 5, and 6. But the idea here is that the days have to now become huge spans of geologic time, and that in that interval, God is somehow creating in a progressive manner. Some would say he is using the process of evolution. Dr. Ross would say that no, in fact, he's not only using the process of evolution to create and make the environment of the earth ready for life, he's also specifically inserting himself and creating specific kinds of life, and eventually specifically Adam and Eve, human life. And there are some interesting speculations on, well, what does that mean to the human hominid lineages? Were those individuals, if they were actually human-like, were they soulless? Where did we get Adam and Eve from? Were they Neolithic farmers that God just took from one place and blessed? Well, obviously, this kind of a scenario can get very complicated, and it doesn't solve the contradictions in the sequences that we see. It just spreads out the time intervals to try to encompass more of those kinds of factors, but it doesn't resolve the sequence problems. And it doesn't resolve how Eve could be created from Adam if they were both Neolithic farmers side by side that evolution had created. There's all kinds of problems that carrying the stick creates. Because if you have the stick of deep time, you've got to put it somewhere. The second model for this is the gap model, the gap hypothesis. And that is that there was a gap between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, which can be filled with the geologic layers. So here we have our big stick, and we're going to take it and put it right down in between. And God created the heavens and the earth, millions and millions of years of geologic time, and then the earth became formless and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And so suddenly, in between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 are all these layers of time, of long periods of death and development of animals and extinction and what appears to be, the judgment of God on this pre-creation civilization. And it's an interesting place to stick the stick of geologic layers, of geologic time. But it's a record of creation and then death, before creation again, before you even start on the days of creation. It seems difficult to reconcile with any other scriptural model or anything that we would accept. But it's one of these models that is somebody's idea of where to put the big stick of time. Now, there are several other old Earth models. And again, you've got this big old stick of millions and millions of years. You've got to put it somewhere. Where do you put it? Well, you can say, I'm just going to accept the standard evolutionary scenario, the Big Bang all the way on, and I'm going to say that God is the guider of that. That is now called, instead of theistic evolution, that is now called evolutionary creation or evolutionary creationism. It is a God-guided process that millions and billions of times God intervened in the process of evolution to make sure that certain instances occurred, certain mutations, certain selection patterns to develop life and to develop life into the diversity that we have. The caveat is that it looks at Genesis 1 through 11 as a non-literal story, as sort of a mythology kind of a story, that it's interesting myth just like other creation myths, but we know that evolution is true and it took millions of years. Therefore, if we're going to have God and evolution, God must have used evolution, so they call it evolutionary creation. Another model of long-time creation is the framework model. And this is where Genesis 1 through 11 is not history, and it's not chronological. In fact, it's just a literary framework. This was Moses' idea, Moses' concept of how God would have created the world, and there are pairs of days, one day paired with day 4, day 2 paired with day 5, day 3 with day 6. In other words, that God would create environments, and then on the corresponding day, he would fill that environment. He created the seas, and then he would fill them. He created the land, and then he would fill that. And then day 7 is an unending day. That is, we are still in the 7th day of creation, where God is resting. Again, long period of time. It would accept evolution as having been essentially the way God created, maybe not necessarily knowing other instances where God would have intervened, but certainly does not accept the short time frame for the model of creation. The third long age model here on this slide is the revelatory model, or the revelation model. And this is an idea that the days of Genesis 1 are the days in which God spoke, or in a vision, and revealed to Moses what he did. And it took 6 to 7 days. In other words, Moses sat there and God played for him or explained to him what it was like for him to develop the universe and the earth. And Moses sat back, perhaps as if watching a movie, in a vision that it took 6 days to understand from God what his creative work was all about. But those 6 days are not the actual days of creation. And so that would also accept these long periods of time, and again, long periods of time being synonymous with the process of evolution and the process of deposition of these geologic layers. So there's more models than that. But the point is that when you have this big stick of long geologic time, you have to put it somewhere. When you do that, something gets changed. Again, because you're taking the general revelation and looking at it first over the special revelation. And so you accept the geologic ages and millions of years in evolution and radioisotope dating. Something gets changed. And it's very clear that in these models, Genesis 1 through 11 becomes myth, becomes story, it becomes allegory, non-literal, becomes fiction, it becomes, if you're lucky, a literary framework that might have meaning. It becomes the days of a vision to Moses. It becomes everything except literal historical truth. So if we go back to what the American Scientific Affiliation says, their little diagram, that it's interesting to realize that their criticism of the young earth creationist is that creation is only one interpretation of Genesis 1. And so they have others of interpretation, as we've seen. But this creation scenario, young earth creation scenario, is only one narrow, relatively recent view of Genesis. And they say, we're really trying to ask questions of Genesis that it wasn't designed to answer. You don't ask scientific questions of a theological book. And anyway, your interpretation is just that. It's an interpretation. And there are other interpretations. And when you come to science, science is rather more solid in their view than this one particular interpretation. So they use this word interpretation as a sort of a real criticism of not having the big stick and not carrying the stick of millions of years. And so, again, if you go back to the special creation model, doesn't require that millions of years of a big stick. It looks at Genesis as a historical account, a very plain reading of the words. Yom actually means a day instead of a long period of time. And there are some interesting questions that you can ask when, if somebody says Yom can mean a long period of time, that's the Hebrew word for day, or one of the words. And yeah, it could mean a long period of time, but it could also mean 24-hour period. And the question is, when does it mean a 24-hour period, and when does it mean a long period of time? And if you know that it means a long period of time, you ought to know when it means a 24-hour period. And so people will say, well, it means a long period of time in Genesis 1. It's like, well, fine, when does it mean 24 hours? That's a good little question and answer kind of a session to go through in your own mind. If it's a long period of time, do you know when it actually means 24 hours? And so we go back to say, yes, the creation model is one particular interpretation. But that criticism comes from people with the big stick of long periods of time that in and of themselves are particular interpretations. In other words, the geologic ages, the millions of years, is based on a uniformitarian assumption that what we see in the present is what happened in the past, that there was no catastrophic changes, and that these rocks, these layers of rocks, represent then millions and hundreds of millions of years. Well, would it make a difference if those rocks were sedimentary rocks? Sedimentary rocks are rocks that are laid down by water. They're not igneous rocks. They're not rocks that are formed like from a volcano, lava coming up and slowly hardening after it cools. These are sedimentary layers that are water deposited. Would that make a difference if you'd have to have water depositing these many, many layers of hundreds to thousands of feet of geologic layers? If evolution, if you looked at the process of evolution, and you looked at the fossil record of life diverging from itself and becoming the tree, the leaves of the tree of evolution that we see, what would happen if there were systematic gaps in the fossil record? If there were no transition forms? What would that do to the validity of the idea or the concept of evolution, of one life form changing into another? And if you look at radioisotope dating, what would happen if those dates were inaccurate? What would happen if you would have sedimentary, igneous rocks that come from volcanic eruptions that are dated at hundreds of millions of years by these techniques, and yet they're claimed to be accurate? What would happen if each of these three kinds of proofs of long periods of time were actually a particular interpretation of the data? And what would happen if the geologic ages didn't form in a long period of time? What would happen if evolution didn't occur over a long period of time? And what would happen if the isotopes really weren't the right clock to use? This, by the way, is a Boy Scout without a stick. What model is the best if you don't need the stick of millions and hundreds of millions of years? What model would be the best?